Alex Coleman stared out the small, circular window of his habitat, watching the endless expanse of the Martian desert stretch into infinity. Red dust swirled in the wind outside, creating a faint haze that blurred the jagged mountains in the distance. It had been nearly 2 years since he set foot on this barren planet, the first human to live on Mars, alone. The mission was groundbreaking, humanity's first attempt at establishing a permanent presence on another planet. The goal was to set up an operational base, conduct research, and prove it could be done. But after a catastrophic solar flare crippled their communication systems, Alex lost contact with Earth. They promised a rescue mission, but he hadn't heard anything in months. Now it was just him, the Martian landscape, and the silence. At first, Alex had followed the routine religiously, daily system checks, recording video logs, tending to the crops in the greenhouse. But lately, the isolation was starting to wear on him. His days had become a blur of empty tasks and growing frustration. He was surviving, but just barely. He sighed, rubbing his temples as a dull headache pulsed in his skull. The supply of painkillers was running low. So was the water. He pushed away from the window and walked over to the control panel, tapping a few buttons to check the status of the water recycler. The numbers blinked back at him, cold and mechanical. 78% efficiency, declining. Of course, he muttered, shaking his head. Everything was always slowly breaking down. He tried to fix what he could, but there were limits to his skills, and to the resources he had. Alex glanced at the clock. 18:03. Time to check the greenhouse. He put on his helmet and gloves, securing the seals of his suit with a soft hiss. The greenhouse was located in a separate module, connected by a short tunnel. He stepped inside, feeling the familiar whoosh of airlocks pressurizing behind him. The plants were thriving, at least, green and vibrant against the stark backdrop of the red planet. He crouched down, inspecting a row of tomatoes, carefully plucking a few that were ripe. These small victories kept him going, even when everything else seemed hopeless. As he stood up, something caught his eye, a flash of movement outside the greenhouse window. Alex froze. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the barren landscape, his eyes searching for any sign of life, any explanation. But there was nothing, just the wind swirling dust into the air. He blinked. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the light. Or maybe he didn't even want to think it. Maybe he was losing it. Hallucinations. That was always a possibility after prolonged isolation. But then he saw it again. A flicker of movement, just on the edge of his vision. It was quick, darting between the rocks in the distance. Not human. Too small, too fast. His breath caught in his throat as he squinted, trying to make sense of it. He stepped closer to the window, pressing his face against the glass. There, just beyond the ridge, a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but different. Taller, slimmer. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with a fluid grace that no human could match. Alex's heart raced. It wasn't possible. Mars was barren, lifeless. NASA had scanned the entire planet. There was no intelligent life here, just microbes, bacteria buried deep in the soil. But the figure was real. It had to be. Alex fumbled for his helmet, his hands trembling as he secured it in place. He barely registered the hiss of air sealing him inside his suit as he rushed to the airlock. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to think this through. But the need to see, to know what was out there, overpowered everything else. He stepped outside, the harsh wind instantly biting at his suit. The Martian desert stretched out before him, desolate and empty. But the figure was still there, watching him from a distance. Alex took a cautious step forward, then another. The figure didn't move. He raised his hand, a small tentative wave. His breath fogged up the inside of his helmet as he waited, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly, the figure raised its hand in return. Alex's mind raced. What was he seeing? Was this some sort of alien life form? Or was he imagining it all, his brain finally cracking under the pressure of isolation? He took a few more steps, his boots crunching in the red dust, and then stopped. The figure remained perfectly still, its dark eyes locked on him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared over the ridge. "No, wait!" Alex called out, his voice muffled inside his suit. He broke into a run, scrambling up the rocky slope, his legs burning with the effort. When he reached the top, his chest heaving, he looked around frantically. But the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Alex stood there, panting, staring at the empty horizon. The wind howled around him, kicking up dust in swirling clouds. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Or had he finally lost his grip on reality? He turned back toward the habitat, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The rest of the day passed in a haze. He went through the motions, checking systems, recording his logs, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the encounter over and over again. That night, as he lay in his bunk, he stared up at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning. If it was real, if there was something else out there, what did it mean? Was he truly alone on this planet, or had he just glimpsed something far beyond human understanding? And if he wasn't alone, what else could be waiting for him in the endless expanse of Mars? As sleep finally claimed him, Alex knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow he would go back to the ridge. The Martian sky was painted a deep, blood-red hue as Eli Novak stepped out of his shelter, his boots sinking into the soft dust. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The silence was deafening, a stillness that only Mars could create. It had been 3 months since Eli arrived at Colony 3, a small outpost meant to be the future of human settlement on the Red Planet. But something had gone horribly wrong. The colony had been bustling when he arrived. Scientists, engineers, explorers, all working to unlock Mars's secrets. Now, he was the only one left. He stood at the edge of the abandoned colony, staring at the empty buildings. The wind howled softly, stirring the fine Martian dust, but there were no other sounds, no voices, no movement. Every member of the colony had vanished without a trace. Eli ran a hand through his short, unkempt hair, his mind racing. There had been no warning, no sign of an impending disaster. One night everything had been normal. The next morning the entire colony was gone. He had tried to contact Earth, desperately radioing for help, but all communications were down. He had sent out distress signals, but no one responded. No ships, no rescue missions, nothing. It was as if the world had forgotten about Mars. He made his way toward the central hub, passing by the empty greenhouses where plants had once thrived. Now, they lay in ruins, the glass shattered and the soil dry. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he entered the main control room. The screens flickered, displaying error messages and corrupted data logs. He had been through this a dozen times, searching for answers, but the system gave him none. Where the hell did they all go? He muttered under his breath, his voice breaking the eerie silence. He slumped into a chair, staring at the mess of equipment scattered across the room. It didn't make sense. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no clues, just an empty colony. As he sat there, his mind drifted to the last thing he remembered before the disappearance. There had been a strange energy anomaly detected near the colony's perimeter. The scientists had been excited, thinking it might be a new discovery, a Martian phenomenon they hadn't encountered before. But Eli had felt something was wrong. That night, he had seen the glow, a soft, pulsating light coming from the distance just beyond the ridge to the north. The others hadn't believed it. They laughed it off, saying it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But now, as the only survivor, he wasn't so sure. Eli stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. He couldn't stay here any longer, couldn't sit in this tomb of a colony waiting for death or madness to take him. He needed to find out what happened, even if it meant going toward that ridge. And then he saw it, the glow. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to pulse with life. It wasn't natural. Eli knew that much. This wasn't a reflection or a flare from his equipment. The light was coming from below, seeping up through the cracked Martian soil. He crouched down, staring at the glowing fissure in the ground. The light pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and it filled him with a growing sense of dread. Eli knelt beside the fissure, peering into the glowing depths. It was impossible to see how deep it went, but there was something down there. Something moving. His hand hovered over his radio, but who was he going to call? There was no one left to answer. A low hum began to vibrate through the ground and the glow intensified. Eli backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the energy building, pressing against him, making the air around him feel thick and oppressive. Suddenly, the ground shifted beneath him. A deep rumble shook the ridge, and Eli stumbled, barely keeping his balance. The glow grew brighter, blinding now, as the fissure widened, and from the depths, a figure began to emerge. At first it was just a shadow, a silhouette against the light, but as it rose from the fissure, Eli's blood ran cold. The figure was tall, humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Its eyes glowed with the same pulsating light, and its skin shimmered like liquid metal, reflecting the alien landscape. Eli couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its gaze locking onto him. There was no malice in its eyes, but there was no warmth either. It was simply watching. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood there, frozen in the Martian night. The figure tilted its head as if studying him, as if trying to understand. Then, without a sound, it raised its hand, pointing back toward the colony. Eli's heart raced as he turned to look. In the distance, he could see the faint outlines of the colony buildings, dark and empty. Except they weren't empty anymore. Figures, just like the one standing before him, were moving through the colony, dozens of them, their glowing forms walking silently through the structures, inspecting the remnants of human habitation. Eli's breath caught in his throat. They had been here all along, watching, waiting. The colony hadn't vanished. The people had been taken, replaced by these silent watchers. But why? Before he could process it, the figure in front of him moved. It stepped back toward the fissure, its glowing eyes never leaving his. And then, in a fluid motion, it sank back into the ground, disappearing into the light below. The fissure closed, the glow faded. And Eli was alone again. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the place where the figure had disappeared, his mind reeling with the weight of what he had seen. The colony, the people, the watchers, they were all connected somehow. But he didn't have the answers, not yet. As he turned to head back to the colony, the silence of Mars felt different now. He wasn't alone.